What's going on, guys? We're back. We're shooting another video. This time we're going to learn about the scientific method. And this is a cool video, guys, because the scientific method is really science, right? I teach life science or biology, but the scientific method goes beyond biology. It goes to physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. All sciences follow the scientific method. All scientists use the scientific method. So what is it? Let's get after it, right? So the scientific method, guys, is just a way of thinking. It's the way scientists kind of find answers to questions, right? You ask a question, then you try to find out the answer, right? And the way they do it is they use this. I'm gonna go through some steps. We're gonna talk about maybe 4 kind of different steps. Sometimes there's extra ones, sometimes there's less, but I'm gonna integrate a bunch together today. It's not this standard. I don't want you to think of the scientific method as like, I gotta go no step number 1, no step number 2, no step number 3. Just remember, guys, that is how I kind of do it. I'm going to do it today, but it's really just a way of thinking, right? It's trying to find answers to a question. So let's write that down. So the scientific method is a process to find answers to a question. It's a process, guys. Process to find answers to a question. Process to find answers to a question, right? This is cool. So you can think of scientists as like detectives. Like they're the detectives of the world. They're trying to figure things out. Scientists are like detectives. All right? And there's a great scientist who he's pretty famous. He's one of the most famous scientists today. Is Neil deGrasse Tyson has this great saying about what he thinks about science in today's school, right? He thinks our natural curiosity, this natural scientific method, this process that we have ingrained into our brains to find answers to questions, we have this when we're born. We're born naturally curious, trying to find answers, right? He thinks today's traditional schooling sometimes kind of strikes that out of us and just makes us memorize stuff. So that's why I want you to remember, guys, I am going to go through these steps, but they're not necessarily step by step, right? It's really just this process, okay? And there are going to be some things you're going to have to know from this class. Yes, there's going to be some memorization, but regardless, if you get out of this class, go on to the next grade, just remember, guys, science is a way of thinking. It's a scientific method. Okay, now let's talk about the first step of the scientific method, right? This might be a little different than maybe you've heard before, and kind of combining 2 together. The first thing, if you want to figure something out, you gotta make an observation, and then you create a question. You ask a question, like you see something in the world, and you say, what the heck is going on, right? So an observation, guys, is, I have to clarify, a difference between an observation and an inference. So an observation is something like factual that you can experience this with your senses. So we have 5 senses, right? We can touch, taste, see, hear, and smell, right? And through those 5 senses, that's how we experience the world. So we can make an observation with one of those senses. If we can't observe something, we can't really do science with it, guys. Like if we can't experience it with our senses and it's not measurable, right? We can't really do science. So if we're talking about a ghost, I know some people push back on me on this one. It's like, oh, can you measure certain things about a ghost? But I don't think so. Right? If you're talking about your soul, I don't know, it'd be tough to measure with science. These are things that you can't really experience with your senses, so science can't really deal with them. So that's the first thing. You need to make an observation. So that'd be something like saying, Mr. Henriquez is talking in front of a camera. That's an observation. Versus an inference is based on that observation, and it leads you to think something. You can maybe say, Mr. Henriquez likes talking in front of a camera, but that's an inference, right? How do you know I like it? I might not like doing this. I do. That's a good guess. But that's the difference between observation and inference. All right, so you make an observation, and then you create a question, and you ask, what's going on, right? And your question has to be testable. So let's write this down. The first step is form a question about the world and how it works. Whoa, form a question. Form a question about the world and how it works. All right, so that's really the first step. You just gotta be curious. You gotta be constantly be asking questions. I always say this in my class, I think this is awesome saying, the quality of your thinking is shown in the quality of your questioning. Questioning is a huge, important part of life, I think. I think always stay curious. That's like the basic necessity to be a good scientist. You gotta be curious, right? So you ask a question from an observation. So I'm gonna do an example today. Let's say maybe you're looking at plants, and for the most part you're like, I'm always looking at these plants and I notice they're always growing out of some dirt or out of some soil. And you're like, do they have to always be in dirt? What if they had no dirt? Can they grow just straight out of water? That's a great question, right? So that would be a question. That would be the first step. So I'm gonna write EX, for example. EX. And my question example today might be, if I put seeds in water, I'm going too far. Plants grow in soil. That's my observation. Plants grow in soil, right? So I made an observation. I noticed that plants usually grow in soil. And then from that observation, I'm going to create a question. And then I'm going to ask, can they grow without soil? Right? What the heck? We notice this is like what we always notice, but can we change it? Can it be different? That's a great question. All right, so after that, we've got to go to step number 2 of the scientific method, which is to form a hypothesis. So this is a word we use all the time in science. So a hypothesis is really just a prediction. It's a prediction to your question, right? So it's really, what do you think? Can they not? You answer it, and then we go to the next step, but we're going too far. First thing I have to clarify is a hypothesis. A lot of people say it's an educated guess, but some people push back on that definition because they think educated guess isn't a good enough definition, because a hypothesis must be something you can measure and something that you can test, right? So let's write this down. Hypothesis is, I think of it as a prediction. A prediction, right? It's a prediction to your question, right? Prediction to your question. So I'm going to write my example hypothesis. A lot of times when you're starting out creating a hypothesis, you do an if-then hypothesis. If I do something, then this is what I expect to see, right? So my example, EX, if, let's go black, sorry. All right, red. If I put plants in water without soil, if I put plants in water without soil, then what's your prediction? What do you expect to see? Then they will not grow. Ooh, interesting, interesting. If we put them in water without any soil, I'm predicting, making my hypothesis, I'm predicting that the plants won't grow. Okay, that's a hypothesis, right? It's a prediction to the question you came up with as step 1. So part 1, part 2, make an observation, create a question, and then form a prediction or hypothesis, right? That must be testable and must be measurable. Remember, science only deals with things that are measurable through our 5 senses, right? We can measure the length, we can measure the volume of things, all these different measuring tools that we have, but it has to be testable. So that's step number 3. So now you got this great prediction, but how do you know if you're right? How do you know if you're wrong? You gotta test it. Yeah, you gotta test it. So step number 3, boom, so test the hypothesis with an experiment. Yeah, how are you gonna find out? You gotta collect data and find out if you're right or wrong, if your prediction's correct, right? So step number 3 is all about experimentation, collecting as much data as you can. So you test your hypothesis with an experiment in order to collect data. All right, collect data, you need to collect evidence. Collect data / evidence. Right? Remember, you can always make a claim. Remember, in this class, guys, you always got to support claims with evidence and reasoning. That's what scientists do. They make a claim or a prediction, a hypothesis, right? But then they got to back it up with some evidence. How do they get that evidence? They collect it through the form of data by performing an experiment, right? That's step number 3. There's kind of 2 main groups of an experiment, okay? We have something called a control group in an experiment, and we have something called the experimental group when you do an experiment or conduct an experiment, right? And what the control group is, this is kind of like the normal conditions, right? This is what you compare all of your experimental data to. You compare like what you're changing, all the experiment, to what's normal, right? So the control group is what you compare against. What you compare against, right? You can kind of think of this, I'm going to write normal conditions in parentheses. Normal conditions. So these are kind of the normal conditions, right? So let's go back to our example of the seeds and soil versus without any soil and just water, right? So the normal conditions, for the most part, in this example would be seeds and soil, because that's what we see all the time, right? So our control group is, I'm going to EX, control group in that example is seeds in soil, right? That's what we see most of the time, right? But we want to know if we change things, right, are we still going to see a difference to this normal condition? So that's when we create an experimental group. So if our normal conditions is seeds in soil, that's our control, what's our experimental group going to be? Yeah, it's going to be seeds not in soil, just in water, right? But there's something important. Within the experimental group, there's these two variables. We have something called the independent variable and the dependent variable, right? And variables are just conditions within, or factors within an experiment, right? So let's go over these two because these are important. So an independent variable is what you change in the experiment, right? So I'm going to write that down. Independent variable is what you change, when you do an experiment. And the dependent variable, okay, depends on this, is what you measure. What you measure. Okay, what you measure in an experiment. All right, so let's go back to our example to make this more clear. So we're talking about our seeds example, and we're having an experimental group, right? That's going to be seeds in just water because that's what we're changing, right? So what you change, independent variable, it's going to be soil to water because we're changing the substrate. We're changing what the seeds are in, right? So the independent variable, EX, is going to be soil to water. And I'm going to write substrate in parentheses. Substrate just means like what the seeds are in, right? They're either in soil or water. So what we're changing is the substrate. That's our independent variable, okay? But then our dependent variable depends on if the seeds are in soil or water. That's what we're measuring. And what are we measuring again? Yes, we're measuring the growth of the plants. Growth of plants, right? So the growth of the plants, right, depends on what substrate it is in, right? It depends if it's in soil or water. So that's our dependent variable. This is our independent variable within our experimental group, right? And we're going to compare all this to our control group to see if our prediction or hypothesis was correct or incorrect, right? So that's super important. So you test the hypothesis in an experiment. You got to collect a bunch of evidence. So you can create a control group, right? Which is the normal conditions that you can compare the experimental group. What you're going to end up changing is the independent variable. So we're changing the substrate. And then what depends on that change is the growth of the plants, whether these plants are going to grow in soil or if they're going to grow just in water, right? So step number 4, the last one, is kind of draw conclusions. So we did a test, we collected all this evidence, but now we have to go back to our hypothesis, our prediction, where we right or wrong, draw conclusions, reject or accept your hypothesis. So I'm going to erase this and talk about the last one. All right. Boom, 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 boom. So we kind of talked about the steps. Remember, scientific method is just a way of thinking, guys. It's trying to find answers to questions. We're detectives when we do science. And you have an observation that you create a question from, that you make a prediction about, a hypothesis that you want to test to collect data from, and then finally, after you've done all that, how do you know if you're right or wrong? Number 4, is draw conclusions. Draw conclusions. So some people will say, oh, you forgot a step, right? Remember, I'm doing this real brief. Maybe if you analyze your data, that could be a whole step by itself. But I'm going to say analyzing is kind of part of the experiment. So I'm going to just jump to number 4, which is draw conclusions. So draw conclusions, guys, from your evidence. Right? This is going to be, so your evidence is going to be your data. Maybe even observations can be used as evidence. So from your data that you collected when you did this experiment, okay, you're going to make an inference. Make an inference. Make an inference. Remember, this is like above an observation. So from all this data, you're making an inference to an inference or explanation for one reason, right? It's to either to support, okay, to support or reject your original hypothesis. hypothesis, boom. Okay, so draw conclusions, last step. From all that data you collected, from all that evidence that you analyzed, right, and you find out if plants grow in water or soil or equal in both or a little bit different in each, from all that data and observations, you're going to make an explanation or an inference to either support, right, you're going to say, support, or reject your original hypothesis or your prediction. You'll notice here, guys, I said support, I didn't say prove, right, because one experiment's not going to prove your hypothesis. You got to do lots of experiments before you can say something's absolutely true. Right? But if you do something that doesn't work, you can also reject as well. You can say, you know what? My prediction, my hypothesis wasn't really correct. You can do more tests to also reject. But you got to do lots of experimentation, guys. Lots of experimentation. Those are the 4 steps. Okay? Hope that was helpful. We talked about scientific method. Remember, big takeaway, it's just a way of thinking, guys. It's trying to find answers to a question, right? The quality of your thinking is showing the quality of your questioning. Always think you are the detectives. You're doing science, right? You make an observation, create a question, you form a hypothesis, do an experiment to see if the hypothesis is true or false by collecting data, and then you draw conclusions to either support or reject your original prediction. All right, that's the scientific method, guys. Remember, be a detective, work hard, get smart, and I'll see you guys next time.